Chapter 13. 99 Kurush in exchange for a hero. With my grandmother's arrival at our house, life became easier for me, since she began to look after Moraza whenever my mother was out. But the cramped communal life of a small house did not suit her temper, however, and she was more than ever uncertain and hard to please in these days. She objected to Mehmed and me playing in the salon, regardless of the fact that there was no other place for us. So we took to accompanying my mother to the marketplace in order to let my grandmother have the house to herself. We depended upon her to get any food, for my mother had long since exhausted her own meagre supply of money. My grandmother kept all her money and valuables in a large tin chest in her bedroom, the keys of which she always carried with her. This habit annoyed my mother, and she ached to be independent. My grandmother continuously grumbled about expenses, but would not forego her wine for dinner. In her especially bad times, she would tell us that my father still owed her money from the sale of the business, which was totally untrue, since she had never been left any ready money by my grandfather. We ate poor quality food, and this, she complained, upset her stomach. She insisted on snowy table linen, despite the fact that soap was expensive and hard to obtain, and would not countenance the same tablecloth on 2 occasions. She sometimes bought little luxury foods and then said that we ate too much. She never forgot she had been a lady and would sit idle in the salon whilst my mother toiled in the kitchen, cooking the choice dishes she still demanded. Moise was the only one of us she seemed to like, and she spent a great deal of her time petting and spoiling her, then complained to my mother that the child was unmanageable. News reached us that Orhan Bey, the husband of Madame Mouan, had been killed, and the names of other men and boys they had known also died from the lips, for one did not like to talk too much about the peaceful dead. One morning, my mother excitedly returned from the market with news that a unit had returned from the Dardanelles to Yeshilkoy, and that perhaps my father was with them. This caused a great deal of speculation amongst us, but finally my grandmother declared it to be nonsense, since if my father had got as near to home as Yeshilkoy, he would somehow or other have sent a message to us. But my mother was not to be easily turned from the scent. The sons and husbands of other neighbours had come back to Yeshilkoy. Why not my father? So one early morning she set off for Yeshilkoy, taking me with her for company. We took the train from Serjekhe station, and I was very thrilled, for it was the first time I had ever been on a train. Despite my mother's warnings, I could not sit still, but had to thoroughly inspect knobs and handles and the tattered upholstery of the seats, and a dozen times or more poked my head out of the window to watch the exciting country flying past us. I was in a seventh heaven of delight, for riding in this train was far more fun even than it had been to ride behind Murat in the old days. I suppose I was not especially curious about meeting my father, being too thrilled with the noise the train was making and the shrill, almost continuous sound of the whistle. I was very disappointed when we last reached our destination, and as my mother hurried me along the platform, I kept looking regretfully back to the great dark monster which had transported us here. My mother inquired from the station master how far it was to the military camp, and he looked doubtfully at her thin, ladylike shoes and replied that it was a long walk. His tone implied doubt that she would ever make it, but he directed her the road to follow. We set out along the bare winter road, but that day there seemed to be just the littlest hint of spring in the air. But long before we reached the camp our pace slackened. Many times we halted to get our breaths back and to ease our aching feet, for the road was bad and our footwear light. At length we came to the top of the last hill, and there, at our feet, lay the camp with its camouflaged tents. Excitement lent new wings to my mother. In any case, it was far easier to descend the hill than it had been to ascend it. We met only a peasant with his mule on the way down, and everywhere was very still, with that stillness especial to the country, only the cawing of the crows to now and then disturb it. When at last we reached the camp, we were breathless, and when an officer in a very ragged uniform came forward to ask our business, my mother had considerable difficulty in answering him at all. She explained, however, why she had come, and he looked vague for a moment or two, as though the name of my father perhaps struck a chord somewhere in his memory. With very great courtesy he begged my mother to wait a little whilst he made inquiries. He walked away from us. When I turned to say something to my mother, I was amazed to see that her eyes were filled with tears. A few spilled down her face, and she said, "Poor man, he looks so tired and shabby. Did you notice that he had his arm and shoulder bandaged? That means he has been wounded and should be in hospital and not walking about this camp." I had a terrible moment of remembering the first words of the song they had sung when they took my father to the war. "E Gaziler," they had sung, "O wounded ones," and my heart began to beat unevenly, for fear my mother should remember too, or read the words in my eyes. Presently 2 soldiers came towards us, and I held my breath expectantly as my mother gave a little gasp. "Can it be your father?" she said, in an unsteady sort of voice, and I started to run towards the soldiers, but she called me back. "Don't go," she said. "They are neither of them your father." And she sat down again to wait until they came up to us, and there was a dull, flat expression on her face that highlighted the cheekbones and broadened the nostrils. As the soldiers came abreast of us, we saw that they were officers, although their uniforms were so shabby that, but for the insignia of rank on their shoulders, we could not have distinguished them from the soldiers. "Ali Bey," she cried to one of the officers, and he saluted her, going red with some sort of emotion that I should never know, and I looked at him curiously, wondering who he might be and how my mother knew him. She asked eagerly for news of my father, and he looked uncertainly at her, as though perhaps weighing up her capabilities for shock, and then he said slowly, "We left him to his God a long time ago," and paused, wondering what else there was to say. Although her face was whiter than I had ever seen it in my life, she said with swift impatience, "Yes, go on. I want to know whatever it is you have to tell me." Then the man called Ali, who was a captain, plunged into conversation to tell her this story. On the march to the Dardanelles, my father had suffered badly from foot trouble. He had to march day and night and day, and his feet began to swell. In the end, they had to cut his torn boots off him. The 2 feet were found to be badly infected, right up to the ankles, and soaked in fresh, bright blood. He had been left by the roadside, as was the custom, and they had called back down the lines that a wounded man lay under a tree. And eventually this message would reach the end of the marching lines, where a horse-drawn cart lumbered for the express purpose of picking up the sick and wounded. But if the cart was already full to overflowing with all the other sick soldiers who had dropped out of the way, well, in that case, man just lay by the side of the road, under the blazing sun, and waited for the next lot of marching soldiers to take up the same old cry that a man lay wounded under the trees by the side of an alien road. Down, down the weary lines the cry would go, but perhaps by the time the sick cart reached the spot, a man would be dead, and there would not be much point in carrying a dead man, when there were so many living who might still be saved. But of course, Captain Ali hastened to assure my mother my father was picked up and taken to a base hospital, where he died. As he told her all these unsavory things, his pale face flickered and his eyes were loath to meet hers. For how could he tell this white, courageous woman that neither he nor anyone else knew where her husband had died? But she persisted in subjecting herself to this useless agony, demanding the name of the hospital, as if the young captain could have told her, even supposing he knew. He was infinitely patient, holding himself stiffly to attention, assuring her that everything that could have been done had been done, and in the end she had to be contented, for there was nothing else he could tell her. So she thanked him, and he saluted her as one brave soldier to another, and she took my hand, and we began the long trudge back to the station. She did not speak to me at all, but walked as if mechanically propelled, never slackening or altering her pace, although my small legs were breaking under me. I begged her to sit down, to let me rest, crying in my tiredness and with cold, for the day had become overcast and all signs of spring had left the air. I tottered beside her and plucked at her skirt, and she looked at me as if she did not recognize me, as if I had brought her back from some far place, and I cried all the more bitterly in this new loneliness. Then I saw expression creep into her dead eyes, and she caught me to her and sat down with me in a ditch. Poor tired boy, she said over and over again, as though she knew no other words, or as though this repetition would still remembrance of something else, something that lurked in the foreground of the mind would not be pushed back with all those other memories that could not be looked upon because they were still too new. She put her arms around me and repeated her meaningless refrain. It frightened me unendurably, for her arms held no security, and her voice no comfort. I did not know if she were speaking to me or to some image of my father, whom she held in her empty rocking arms. Back home, the wind of discontent blew coldly through the house. My mother became almost unapproachable and hard as we had never known her before. My grandmother forgot her grumblings and walked silently before such coldness and insensibility. Back to those days flies memory, to feel again the soft breath of fear on the cheeks, to feel the slow ice around the heart and the feathery, barely perceptible insecurity that crept up on a child. I would catch sight of my mother, sitting idly at her work in the kitchen, or looking steadily at some half-finished piece of sewing in her hands, her face expressing surprise that she should be holding anything, for she could not remember having picked it up. In her eyes would wander a gentle vagueness, its harsh shadow flitting now and then across her face, darkening sanity, although a child's mind did not put it like that. A child was conscious only of strangeness, and she would not emerge from her dreams of the past, even though her children pulled at her arms and their cries beat on her brain. She shut herself away from them all and sat silent for long stretches. It became strange and odd and absent-minded, and fear flourished in the little house, in the unreasoning, illogical way fear will. Whatever she did with the heartless precision of an automatic, and was never heard to mention my father or wonder about the future. My grandmother would try to rouse her out of this lethargic state, suggesting with intentional brutality that she should go to the War Office and find out what she could about my father. At these times my mother would look with her vague look at my grandmother, and one could feel the difficulties she was having in focusing her attention on what had been said to her. Then she would turn her head away and say fretfully that she did not want to discuss the matter, and my grandmother would retire, defeated, helpless in the face of such implacability. It was about this time too that my grandmother became almost totally deaf, and her thick, dark hair showed more and more grey and began to fall out. Decay and rot were setting in everywhere. The day eventually came, of course, when my mother seemed to grow out of her morbidity, when her eyes showed alert awareness again, and she took an interest in those about her. Just as she had been listless before, now she was teeming with energy, as though long sojourn with grief had revitalized her. She spoke of going to the War Office, and when she had made the decision, she was impatient to be off at once. We were left to my grandmother, who nowadays seemed bowed and old, mumbling into the Quran most of the day, doling out money from her tin chest without murmur or protest. The day my mother went to the War Office, she sat in the salon reading from the Quran, talking to herself in a loud, grumbling voice, for she was so deaf that she did not realize she spoke aloud. By the time my mother returned, we were starving, for my grandmother could not be weaned from her prayers to prepare a meal for us. My mother looked tired herself and clicked her teeth exasperatedly when she saw that nothing had been prepared for her. She went to the kitchen, Mehmed and I excitedly running around her, the good smell of cooking that she was creating causing our mouths to water and our empty stomachs to ache. She was unusually patient with us, ignoring it when we snatched eagerly at the fresh, crusty outside of the bread she had bought. When all was ready, we were told to call my grandmother, and we bellowed loudly from the foot of the stairs, and reluctantly she put away her Quran and came down to eat. My mother told us of her day. The War Office had been crowded with other black-clad, anxious women demanding news of their husbands. Harassed officials had bleated that no information could be given and had attempted to restore law and order and dignity to the War Office. But to have restored these that day would have required a Herculean effort, more than the few officials between them could manage, and one of them had retired to get more help. My mother had stood for hours in that smelling, angry queue of humanity, eventually learning that what she had been told by Captain Ali at Yeşilköy had been true. The record showed that my father had been dead for many months. Timidly, my mother had asked where he died, and the official dealing with her had snapped that he could not be expected to know everything. Surely it was enough for her to know that her husband was dead. But are you sure? My mother had pleaded, impotent against such open, uncaring cruelty. I have received no confirmation from you. Why did you not let me know before this, without my having to come here? The official had broken into her words brutally, saying, Hanan, your husband is dead, and with so many dead and dying, we cannot be expected to notify everyone. My mother, remembering, said that he had spoken with great petulance, as though she and all the other unhappy women waiting here were in some way responsible for the deaths of their menfolk, thereby causing this gallant young man a great deal of unnecessary trouble. She had wanted to ask him something else, but he had forestalled her, slamming the wooden window shutter in her face, so that she had been forced to retire. She said that all about her, the women were being treated in the same way, crying, wailing, beseeching for information, old ones and young ones with babies being unceremoniously pushed back from the inquiry windows. Then one woman, driven beyond endurance, commenced to shout insults while she held her startled baby above her head. Dogs, she had shouted passionately. My husband left 5 children behind him and a mother to support. Are you going to support them, you miserable sons of bitches? Did my husband ask to be taken from his work and his family to fight for people like you? Will you give us food to put in our hungry stomachs? Do you care if we go hungry and naked, if strange men insult us in the streets, or if our children die of disease and starvation? Our husbands died to save their country, and then bastards like you shut the windows in our faces because we ask for news. She had been roughly handled by the police and dragged screaming further abuse from the building. My mother, retelling her story, became heated for the injustice done to that woman and to all the women of Turkey. She was right, she insisted passionately to my grandmother's disdainful face. And she was no street woman either, and she would never have said what she said without provocation. We didn't ask for this war. My poor wise Husnu was right when he once said that the conceit of a few men could ruin our country. She commenced to cry bitterly, my grandmother steering uneasily in her chair. She was so deaf that she had heard only part of my mother's speech, and she did not know what to do to give her comfort. My mother raised her head to look at my grandmother. If we had not had your money, she said to her listening, straining face, we could not have survived. There are thousands who have nothing. Still the government ignores them and leaves them to die in the streets. Is this what our men went to fight for? Did my husband leave me for this? If there is a God above, he must show mercy to the widows and orphans who are left. If there is a God above. My grandmother's half-silent ears had caught some of the last words, her lined face puckered with distress. No, she protested gently. Do not call upon God in that way. You will be punished, my child. It is not right for us to question his ways. Ack, said my mother in disgust. Will he feed us, mother? Will he come down from his heaven and put food in my children's hungry stomachs? My grandmother strained pitifully to catch the angry words and shook her head protestingly. No, no, she repeated. It's not right to talk like this. Have you not had enough punishment? Do you want to see your children struck dead or blinded before your eyes? Her direful words made us shiver with horror. My mother said to her, You are old, mother. You will never understand what it is like to lose your husband when you were young. To know that never again will you be able to lie beside him at the end of the day or to feel his warm body close along the line of your back. Your day is finished. You lost your husband when all passion had gone from you long ago, but I lost mine before my body had time to wither. All the young and the brave are dying, and only the women and the helpless children are left. And our good Sultan keeps to his palace and assesses the worth of a man in terms of money, and will give me 99 kurush a month to compensate me for the loss of my husband. My husband, who was young and strong, and who rots in some grave we do not know where. 99 kurush. What is the 99 kurush? Asked my grandmother, bellowing in her anxiety so that Mehmed and I trembled. The pension I shall receive for myself and my 3 children, replied my mother. Pension? Queried my grandmother, not fully understanding anything, I think, but anxious to appear intelligent to the passionate young woman who faced her across the table. My mother carefully kept her patience to explain. Pension is the money you receive from the government if you have lost your husband in the war. They have decided to give me 99 kurush because that is all Husnu was worth to them. I've lost my home because of the war. Ahmed is dead, and Aisha, and Sarayir will soon be less than a memory. My children grow and must be fed, and you and I cling to life because sometimes it is easier to live than to die. Bread is 50 kurush a kilo and lasts us 1 day, 2 if we go hungry. And a man at the treasury today congratulated me because I gave a man to the war. God has blessed you, he said. Your husband died, shahid, for his country, and his place is in heaven. And now, if you will, just sign here, please. And he gave me the paper which said I was willing to accept 99 kurush from my husband. Her passionate voice broke, and she sat staring into space, her eyes full of the saddest dreams, and curiously, but not frighteningly so, oblivious of her family about her. My grandmother noisily sipped her soup, but spoke no word, for her deafness gave her a remoteness from life, and she could not always follow my mother's tripping tongue. The first time my mother went to collect her pension, I went with her to the building that is today the Istanbul College. Everywhere was crowded with pushing, shouting women. The queues reached far down the street, but they were not the orderly, disciplined queues that I came to know so well in wartime England during the Second World War. No, indeed. These queues could scarcely be called queues at all, since they consisted for the most part of women shrieking insults and imprecations at each other, pushing each other out of the way, and arguing spiritedly with the police who, for a time, tried to instill some sense of decorum into the crowds. But the women, en masse, were too much for the police, so they left them to fight out their own battles. My mother and I awaited her turn, she with considerable asperity, and if anyone attempted to take her place, she rounded on them so venomously that the attacker was forced to retire. Her sharp, uncompromising attitude brooked no interference. I admired her for being able to defend herself against these rough women. When it was her turn at the pay window, she looked at the money offered, handed it to me, and told me to go buy sultanas for myself. The official said sharply, "The government gives you that money for your food, sister, not to give it as pocket money to your children. Or are you too rich to need this money?" My mother turned to him viciously, returning to where he stood at the little window, lightly pushing aside the woman who was awaiting her money. "Your job," said my mother with remarkable self-control, "is to attend to the people who come here, not to give them advice, for we none of us need your advice." A cheer went up from the other women. "I wonder how much your munificent sultan pays you in a month." "Enough to feed your family well." I do not think so, for your suit, God help you, is a disgrace to you, and your thin body looks so weak that it is no wonder they did not send you to fight the English. If I give the money I receive here to my son for sweetmeats, it is all I consider it to be worth. I came here to collect a pension, not to listen to your uncalled for advice. I'll have you arrested, spluttered the young man, very red in the face, and I shook with terror, for I thought perhaps he could really do this. And my mother's clear voice rang out challengingly. Try to have me arrested. And the voices of the other women rose threateningly against the arrival of two policemen, who remained, however, at the edge of the crowd, not yet brave enough to wade through that angry, milling crowd to lay hands on my mother. The women shouted hoarsely, Well spoken, sister. And they moved protectingly about her, ready to defend her if the police came too near. She stood staring at the hesitant police, her head thrown back proudly, but they made no move towards her. She moved through the ranks of women, her head still high. Some of the women caught her sleeve as she passed and cried, God bless you, Hanum Effendi. And the police made no attempt to touch her, even though the words she had spoken that morning were treacherous in old Turkey. After that episode, she did not ever again go to collect a meagre pension, but would let me go, for I used to buy nuts or sultanas for myself and Mehmed. But one morning I too had a never-to-be-forgotten experience, and after that the pension lay forgotten, for none of us bothered to claim it. That last day I went, the crowds were as thick as ever, and I patiently awaited my turn. Although many people left the pay windows, still so more many were entering the hall that I never seemed to get any nearer to receiving money. I swallowed my fear of the fierce women and pushed my way between them, sometimes crawling under them, ignoring the threats of the angry men, and succeeded at almost reaching one of the windows. There was a tall man behind me, and, seeing that I was not tall enough to reach up to the ledge with the pay book, he lifted me up. Then, to my intense embarrassment, he inserted his fingers into the crotch of my short pants, and I wriggled and shouted like a mad thing. My threshing legs hit a young woman on the side of the head, and she angrily beat me. The man who held me continued with his investigations, and I screamed wildly and tried to hit out at him. There was an ominous muttering from the crowd, and I struggled to free myself. Easy now, for the man had partially released me. I almost fell to the floor, hurt and bewildered that anyone should want to do such things, and I fled through the crowds, the pension book long forgotten. I ran home as fast as my legs could carry me, although they were trembling so much that I do not suppose I really made very much progress. When I got home, I sobbed out the whole story to my astonished mother, and I saw her mouth tighten. Then she bade me wash myself and to say nothing of this to Mehmed. Afterwards she explained, When you are older, I shall tell you all about these things, for now I am your father and your mother. But always remember that, to certain men, boys are more valuable than girls, especially a nice-looking boy like you. She said no more, beyond adding that I must try to put this day out of my head. But it was hard to put this memory behind me. The shock had been so intense that for many a long day afterwards, I flew like the wind from every man I met. And right through childhood and youth, the suspicion remained, and all men were potential enemies.